What did we cover this week on the deep dive, Ben?
We looked into the global food system. So this sprouted out of a Guardian article that I sent to Anthony a few days after our last recording session. And it was by this guy, George Monbiot.
Names are so difficult.
Yeah, I don't know how to say his name, to be honest. But he is something of a global food systems expert. A lot of my information has come from what he's written.
Okay.
But he was specifically citing a scientific paper that recently came out that said that the risks that climate change is posing to the global food system has been far underestimated. The paper talked about the meanders in the jet stream, which is the band of strong winds a few miles above the Earth's surface at mid-latitudes, and how if it moved a little bit north or south, it changes the weather patterns in significant crop-growing regions. And his point was that climate change is going to make these meanders happen more often and more significantly, which is going to change these weather patterns, and it's going to potentially change them in multiple growing regions at the same time. So what this paper found is that if even a small decrease in crop yields comes from multiple of the major growing locations at once, it poses systemic risk. And so George Monbiot, he talks a lot about the food system as a complex system. What this means is, everything is a complex system. Society is a complex system. The economy as a whole is a complex system. The ecosystem is a complex system. When complex systems become really consolidated, meaning they have like these big nodes, these really important choke points almost, and those nodes of the system have really strong connections, more connections between other really big nodes. It's basically that it's less diversified. It's much more susceptible to shocks.
Right.
And so what this paper and what this guy's point is that with more of these shocks that are going to come from climate change and come from many other things that we'll talk about, the global food system is in a really precarious state. And so I thought it would just be interesting to get into that a little bit more deeply.
I don't think we think about our food. We're in the West, right? We do not think about our food very often. No. We think about we order Uber Eats. We go to supermarkets that are always stocked to the brim. We don't even think about food as a concept of scarcity. We don't even think about it. It doesn't even enter our mind, right?
No.
But thinking about food as a global system and how food gets to where you are is actually really interesting. And it's, I think, one of the most advanced and complex things humans have ever developed is how we're able to get food from all over the world right to your doorstep.
Yeah. And the movement of the food is one thing, but the growing of it is a whole other, right? Because we've kind of maxed out our growing systems so much, which is part of the problem, right? Because we in our pursuit of efficiency, we have given up diversity. But it also means because of technology like fertilizers, right? We grow 2, 3, 4 times more food than we would ever be able to grow without it.
Right. And so I want to talk, I don't want to start here, but maybe we should. We can start with how much food we waste.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So in the United States alone, 40% of the food that we produce is wasted.
Yeah.
That is estimated to be $218 billion, or 1.3% of the United States GDP wasted every year, and fills up our landfills 24%, solid waste. That is, it's a crime. It's a sin.
It's a mind-blowing amount.
It's a mind-blowing amount that 40% of our food is wasted.
And this happens at multiple points in the chain.
Right.
Right. So
it doesn't just happen at the consumer end. It doesn't just happen there. It happens all the way throughout the process of transportation, of picking, all the way through.
Yeah. I mean, I think a really easy example to think about is orange trees in Georgia or Florida, right? All of these oranges that hit the ground and become bruised after falling off the trees, they're thrown out. Because usually, even though they're completely good to eat, I mean, oranges have peels on them, it's not economically viable for these companies. Well, first of all, they can't sell them to stores.
They don't want them.
In America. They don't want them. And it's not economically viable for them to try to ship them overseas. They're not getting incentivized well enough to feed the hungry with
There's
them.
no reason for that, yeah.
So they just chuck them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The paper that I read talking about food waste put it in a really interesting frame where they said there's actually a massive economic opportunity in the realm of food waste. And they say there's $155 to $400 billion economic opportunity. They argue that investing $14 billion in cost-effective solutions per year over the next 10 years could reduce food waste by 45 million tons for each of those years.
Wow.
It would result in a $73 billion in annual net financial benefit to the United States and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 75 million metric tons, save a shit ton of water, and recover the equivalent of 4 billion meals for people in need over 10 years.
Wow.
So I think it's nice to see that there's solutions getting put out there. But when I read through them, they were pretty lame.
Really?
They looked to me like they were written by like a consultant, and not to poop on consultants because I am one, but it was too high level. It didn't have the nitty gritty that I thought it really needed to be a solid plan.
Okay.
Maybe that's happening internally and I just can't see that part, and they only publish the high level stuff for public consumption. That's possible. But it is good to know that people are thinking about this in the realm of economic opportunity, and they are finding it to fit in our current market system.
True. I would expect that someone in agriculture would kind of have to be the one to take the first leap.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe it would probably have to be one of these massive conglomerates that owns a ton of the supply chain already.
Right. Well, I think they're arguing for a new node in the process. They're arguing for a new node. The food stability, the food sustainability node.
Yeah, and I like that idea. It's just about the amount of upfront capital that it would take.
Right, so they argue $14 billion per year. That's a lot of money.
Yes. Yeah, that's a startup can't really raise that.
No.
And that's why it feels like
that should be like a US department.
Yeah.
That should be like a US department that is going to be taking care of that.
Mm-hmm.
And look, there's other arguments too in regards to food waste that like food production isn't our issue. It's just how we distribute the food. Mm-hmm. And right now we're only distributing the food based off who has the money to pay for the food. Mm-hmm. And that's causing a lot of problems because very poor areas of the world don't have the money to buy this food. Mm-hmm. And it's not economical to ship the food to them based off the profit motive definition of economical, right? I think there is an economical incentive to keep people alive, but there isn't a direct short-term profit incentive to do so.
Exactly. Not for the companies in this economy.
Right.
Right? And it's interesting because there is certainly enough food produced every year to feed everyone in the world.
Of course.
It's something like 3,000 calories are produced. But here's the thing, like part of it is because the food goes to the people with money. But part of it is because about half of the calories we produce right now feed livestock.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. And that's a huge part of this issue. And I guess I can get into this now is
please, that's awesome.
As people get richer, they want more diverse diets. They want more expensive types of foods. Meat,
beef
is really where you go for that a lot of the time, right? So because the cheap foods are the corn, the wheat, the rice, right? They're the ones that just come out of the ground. Mm-hmm. But feeding and raising a cow or a pig, that's a lot more expensive. It takes a lot more land. But the thing is, the world has been getting richer. China's the perfect example, right?
China beef consumption has gone through the roof.
Yeah.
In the last 20 years.
I mean, China since the 70s has brought 750 million people out of poverty.
Right.
So these people are eating more meat, which means that we have to grow more food to feed these animals, and take up more land with the livestock. And again, it means that the food is being consolidated more towards feeding the rich with these very diverse diets.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is this isn't changing anytime soon. Like more and more of the world, yes, like more and more of the global south is going to be coming into a place to diversify their diets.
What about synthetic meat? Lab-grown meat?
It's possible. There are possible solutions.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
but you're saying
but as far as the diet changing
yes,
in that direction.
Yes, I totally agree. The people in poverty who are going to be coming out of it will definitely be looking for more expansive diets, no doubt about it. And they're going to be wanting importing beef, whether it's synthetic or not. They're going to be wanting to import beef.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I didn't really do any research on the livestock aspect of that because so much of it's going to that.
Yeah. I mean, half of all food grown.
All right, guys. So you might know the camera quality go down at this point. The battery died.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate reality. But
so maybe that means we have to make the show shorter or get another battery for the camera.
Yeah.
Probably that. I don't think I can shut up.
It's going to be hard to limit ourselves.
I know.
Yeah. We are close, though.
We are close.
Ish.
We're close-ish.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right. So I want to talk about, we're talking about global food supply. I want to talk about the Global Food Security Index that was released for 2022.
Okay.
It goes around 4 key pillars it focuses on. It focuses on affordability, availability, quality and safety, and sustainability and adaptation. These are the 4 pillars that the index is based around. And what they're noticing is a downward trend in food security over the last 4 years. It's not just from COVID. It also took place in 2019 as well. Mm-hmm. So the best countries in the world are Finland, Iceland, Norway, shocker. The worst countries in the world are Syria, Haiti, Yemen. America is sitting at 13th right now. Yeah, we're sitting at 13th. Which is the worst place to be, but we're the United States. We should be better.
Yeah.
Between 2019 and 2022, the index's affordability score, which I think is the most important here, has fallen by 4%, from 71.9 to 69, as shocks like COVID-19 pandemic, high input costs, and the war in Ukraine, as we will talk about in depth on how the war in Ukraine is affecting this. Obviously, the worst place in the world for this global food security index score is sub-Saharan Africa. Best in the world is North America. Europe is sitting very happily right below North America, but the European countries that are doing so well, Finland, Iceland, just top the list and drag the average up a lot. But what is interesting here is we have plateaued since 2019 in global food security. The index began in 2012, and we started at around 36. Right now, we're hovering at around 71. And we're hovering right now at 62. And we haven't seen any growth in the last 4 years. And what is causing that? A lot of what's causing that is the high costs of input prices, the shock effects of climate change affecting yields. And I think we should talk about what we have about climate change affecting global food security.
Okay. So what climate change does is it means that big destructive weather events are going to be much more common. Big destructive weather events destroy crops and they lower crop yields. So what this means is our food supply is going to dwindle, but it's also going to become much more uncertain.
Right, and the uncertainty is very, very dangerous.
Yes, it's the volatility, because the growing season happens on a very set schedule, right? And if you miss a time to put your fertilizer down, if your soil ends up getting torn up by a tornado or a hurricane, or you miss a time to harvest because your crops have been destroyed,
right,
you can't get those back. And the thing is, you can't, unlike, say, a financial crisis, where you can use future money to bail out banks that have failed, you can't get future food.
Right. You can't get future soil that gets torn up by a tornado.
Exactly.
What I was reading here is climate-induced food shocks used to happen once every 12 years, but right now it's happening once every 2.5. So they're becoming more frequent.
Yeah.
They're becoming harder to predict.
More extreme.
They're more extreme. Making our system resilient to this is going to be priority number one.
Yeah.
And that's why the thing that this index recommends the most is research and development specifically about those areas.
Sure.
And also to limit the amount of manual input that is necessary in growing food.
Yeah, so I found one solution about supporting development and uptake of perennial grain crops.
What does that mean?
So grain usually needs to be replanted every year.
Oh.
And just recently in China, actually, they were able to crossbreed a rice plant that doesn't need to be replanted every year, but instead every 5 or 6 years. And so this is huge because it's going to reduce soil turnover and soil erosion, and it's going to mean that these are more deeply rooted plants that can resist intense weather events.
That's
better.
amazing. That's amazing. That's incredible.
So that's
absolutely incredible.
And so I don't know where you were going to go next here, but we're talking about climate change as one of the areas for shocks. The other big one that I have is geopolitics.
Yeah. I mean, the next one I have is conflicts on my list. But before I go there, I want to just bring one last final point about one of the awful situations about all of this. There isn't just an inequality in food distribution across the world. There's an inequality financially to the people who produce the food. So farmers on Earth produce 95% of the food, but they comprise 65% of the world's poorest people. So there's a massive disparity between the people who feed us and the lives that they are able to live based off of their amazing service. And I think that's a true travesty. And I think in the United States, I think farmers are having a more difficult time, especially the independent farmer, year after year.
Yeah.
And the government tries to bail them out with the farm bill every year, which we'll be talking about in the end of August. That'll be written in September. And how we deal with that is going to be very important, because if you want to talk about adding a bunch of nodes, you get that by having individual family farms.
Yeah.
If you consolidate all the things onto big agriculture, you're making one big gigantic node, right?
Yeah.
You're not diversifying at all.
Yeah, that's one of the problems that I absolutely. So we're very soon going to get into how consolidated this global food supply is.
Okay.
But yeah, in the United States, for example, there are just a few companies that are buying up every one of these individual farms, because the farmer will not be able to support himself, and then the company will come in and they'll be like, hey, you can keep doing your thing, but we're just going to own your farm.
Yep.
So they can back him with their money, but they can also underpay him. Right. And so a lot of farmers, even if they do work for these big companies, they'll need to have side jobs because they're underpaid by those companies.
And that's what's happening right now. That's why 65% of the world's poorest people are farmers, even though they produce the most important thing to everyone's life.
Yeah.
So let's move on to geopolitics. I have how conflicts is deepening the the food crisis, and specifically the war in Ukraine, obviously. Yeah. You might have heard about it. It has supercharged a three-dimensional crisis about food, energy, and finance, but the food is what we're going to be focusing on today. So I noticed, first of all, the index is noting that the world is actually falling into a more conflict-heavy and more conflict-frequent cycle in our story as humans here.
Yes.
We are been on the downturn since 2012, and we have become more violent. Which is unfortunate. But how is the war in Ukraine specifically affecting stuff? Well, Ukraine exports a lot of wheat on the world. Yeah. They're the 5th largest wheat exporter. And I think almost the top sunflower oil exporter. They are, right? So where does the Ukrainian grain go? Ukrainian grain goes to Egypt. It goes to Turkey. It goes to Indonesia.
Yeah.
What else you got?
I have Lebanon. So I have Egypt gets 85% of its wheat exports from Ukraine. Lebanon, 81%. Tunisia, 50%. These North African and Middle Eastern countries, super dependent on Ukraine.
And these are developing nations that cannot handle shocks in their food supply.
No, they absolutely cannot sustain themselves.
No.
They need to import most of their food.
Right.
And so what's happened now, so there were already issues, obviously, because Ukraine is busy fighting a war in trying to get its grain out. But there had been an agreement that was struck in July of last year. So this agreement was brokered by Turkey between Putin and Russia and the UN to say that the Ukraine should be able to export its wheat so that these needy countries wouldn't starve. Putin agreed to it. So basically what happened is the Ukrainians would get their wheat to one of the ports on the Black Sea, and Turkey and those merchant vessels then would be guided through mine-free waters into one of the Turkish ports, who would then distribute the food into the Middle East.
Yes. Now, Russia argues that the food wasn't going to poor countries. They're lying.
Yes.
They're just lying. That's fine, but they're lying, and you should know that. As a part of this deal, Russia also got exemptions to some European and Western sanctions to sell their fertilizer abroad, which is good for everybody.
Yeah.
The West needed an excuse to buy Russian fertilizer because we need fertilizer, as we'll talk about. And Russia wants to sell more of their stuff abroad. So that was a part of the bargain.
Yeah, but Russia is also claiming that the agreement that they had to lift some of those sanctions wasn't completely honored by the West, which is why a week ago, Russia backed out of the grain deal. And so this is one of those big shocks on the global food system, because now it seems like this Ukrainian grain won't be able to be exported this season. So Egypt, where 85% of their wheat comes from Ukraine, is in a terrible, dangerous position right now. But this is just one of many examples that could come from conflict and geopolitics, right?
Right, but I want to stick on Russia one more time, because as of today, they currently bombed a port on the back door of the Danube River. And this port held grain ships full of grain. Russia has bombarding Ukrainian Black Sea ports since it officially withdrew a week ago from the Black Sea. And now this is limiting. This is like a war crime. You're limiting food supply to the whole world.
Yeah,
you're threatening the global food supply by doing something like this.
They're purposely trying to reduce any income to Ukraine as much as they can, and to get rid of Ukraine's
position in the world, so no one wants to defend it. They're trying to isolate it.
And their ability to feed their own population.
Sure.
They're trying to kill as many Ukrainians as possible.
Right.
Which is very war crime. So this is one avenue. Like, this is kind of an obvious one, right? Ukraine can't get its food out. Also, we have all these sanctions on Russia. So even though we want its fertilizer in the system, we're also the West is going to get less of its food. So it's like since the bonds in the complex system can't web out to as many countries now, they're becoming more consolidated, and the system's becoming less resilient in that way.
Exactly.
Do you want to go fertilizer next, or do you want me to talk about why this system is like...
No, let's do fertilizer now.
Okay.
So what's going on with fertilizer? So as we talked about, there were specific exemptions in the sanctions regime put on Russia and Belarus to continue exporting their fertilizer, but they have currently fallen and due to the war, and this is causing a massive shock globally. And so shortages have been compounded by export controls by China as well, which also produces a lot of fertilizer.
Yep.
And the Chinese account for 30% of global phosphate fertilizer supplies. As a consequence of the measure, the protection to protect it, and they're doing this to protect their internal domestic market. And so China's exports shrunk by 50% in 2022 in the fertilizer industry. And we were talking about Chinese exports last week, and maybe some of Chinese exports declines is on purpose.
You think so?
Well, that's what this is.
As far as food.
As far as food,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
That
as
makes
far
sense.
as food, yeah, they're doing that on purpose.
I can see that.
So now, what is China? China is exporting much, much less. So we are talking about a massive decline, which peaked in around June of 2021, and we're now down to about a fifth of what it was, maybe even less than a fifth of its peak in June of 2021.
Wow.
That's how less we're getting. So who is getting this Chinese fertilizer? Domestic Chinese prices are currently around the same because they've been able to hold in their supply and their inventory, right? Well, Brazil has currently seen a $1,000 ton quoted for their fertilizer, and Brazil is one of the top exporters of Chinese fertilizer. Other Chinese partners in this are India and Pakistan. India is a massive country with a massive agricultural community, and also a geopolitical enemy of China. So China's cutting out of India. Yeah, it takes away a quarter of its total fertilizer exports, but it's also kneecapping a geopolitical adversary, and they're using this as a weapon.
Yeah.
Which is the opposite of what you're supposed to do. We've seen fertilizer price because of the Russia thing and the Chinese thing. We've seen fertilizer prices triple, more than that, quadruple.
Yeah. Well, in addition to China, Russia is a huge exporter of potash and phosphorus, as well as Belarus,
Yep.
who is not exporting anymore in its alignment with Russia. So these global prices are just skyrocketing.
Now, the United States is responding, which I'm happy to see. Joe Biden has put aside $500 million in programs to increase domestic fertilizer production under the Fertilizer Production Expansion Program. And some aspects of this I want to read out. So what can funds be used for? Funds can be used to build new facilities and buying an existing facility or purchasing land, covering pre-development costs like engineering and other professional fees, providing working capital to expand capacity or increase outputs, and other things like that. One aspect I liked about it was it had a Made in America guarantee. All fertilizer production expansion program products must be produced by companies located in the U.S. or its territories, create good paying jobs at home, and reduce the reliance on potentially unstable or inconsistent foreign suppliers. So this is another aspect of the United States decoupling.
Yeah.
Right? That's what this is. Onshoring. The end of globalization.
Deglobalization.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
It's in everything.
And in the food system, it's the most dangerous thing.
The worst thing you could do.
Yeah. And so now I think I can get into my spiel a little bit. So we're talking about how the food system is a complex system. We've got these nodes, we've got these connections. And I've been making hints about how this is getting less resilient. How much less resilient is it? Well, when these systems get more they get stronger connections between the nodes, and the nodes get bigger, they get more important, then it's more susceptible to collapse. And so what happens when these systems collapse is they tip into a different state of a different steady state, and you can't it takes an enormous amount of energy to revert back to that steady state. As the food system, each of these shocks is kind of going to tip us further into a new normal of the food system. And you can already see, it seems like we're tipping towards something that is much less globalized. And so I'll start this by saying how much we need a globalized food system.
Yep.
25% of the world could be fed by food grown within 100 kilometers of them. That's 3/4 who couldn't be fed.
That's crazy.
Our population is completely dependent on this. Okay. And so this is how precarious things have now become. First of all, our global diet. Okay. It's become extremely homogenous. 4 crops make up 60% of what we eat.
God.
Wheat, rice, corn, and soybeans.
What a nightmare.
Trade. to these bonds between these nodes has increased massively. Between 1961 and 1970, global trade in agricultural products increased by $18.6 billion. That seems like a lot, right? From 2009 to 2018, it rose by $488 billion. Okay? It's a crazy amount of acceleration. And again, this is partly because of the diet structure of developing countries changing. You need more different types of foods from different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying this is being driven by people coming out of poverty wanting more expansive diets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In large part. Not entirely, but in large part. What about producers of these foods as far as countries? Okay. 4 countries harvest 76% of the world's corn. Okay. USA, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa lead the pack. Ukraine was one of them, but I was looking at 2022 data. They were not one of them in 2022.
Wow, that's crazy.
5 countries sell 77% of the rice. 5 countries supply 65% of the wheat. Number 1 being Russia, number 5 being Ukraine. 3 countries supply 86% of the soybeans. All of this is being more consolidated. Nations are polarizing into super importers and super exporters. 5 countries, China, Korea, it's grouping the Koreas, Japan, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, are responsible for about 40% of food net imports. 7 countries, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, New Zealand, Thailand, and the USA, account for about 55% of total net food exports.
Wow, that's insane.
Since 1900. Okay. So this is where the food's coming from and where it's going.
Okay.
What about how the food is grown? Well, since 1900, the world's crops have lost 75% of their genetic diversity, which means they're way more susceptible to pandemics going through plants
or viruses.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically, this push for efficiency is coming at the cost of resilience. And the one other thing I'll get into here is what about the actual companies, right? How much are they doing? How consolidated are they?
Oh, God.
4 companies, Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, and Louis Dreyfus, control, on one estimate, 90% of the global grain trade. 4 more companies control 66% of the agricultural chemical markets, and 4 more control 53% of the global seed market. This is insanely consolidated. Oftentimes, this guy that I read will compare it to the global financial system before 2008, except this is worse. This is more consolidated than that was.
Wow.
And
this
so
is crazy. And this is why I want to interrupt, because I just want to really push on. This is why we need antitrust legislation and people in the FTC who are really going to take this stuff seriously. And I just want to say, like, it doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican. When you hear that, you should get really scared.
Yeah.
Because this is way above politics. This is a bad economic model.
Yeah.
This is a bad economic model.
Exactly.
This is way above politics, man.
Yes. To have an economic model that is rewarding the biggest companies by making them bigger and bigger constantly is not good for society or the world.
No, you are destroying food diversity.
Yeah.
And you are destroying our ability to have a resilient food network.
Exactly. This is extremely dangerous. Like, people in the poorest countries are so endangered right now. It is hunger was decreasing year after year by pure volume of people until 2015 because of this interconnectedness of the global food system that's losing its resilience and making it more susceptible, more sensitive to these shocks. So what happens when these shocks hit? Well, we've already seen the effects of the Ukraine war. There are other instances in 2008 and 2011 where they were the biggest food price spikes, right? And I think it was because there were lower harvests that year.
Yeah, there was pretty bad droughts.
And or maybe it was bad droughts, because I think in some places they produced even more wheat than they got on a usual year. And I think the global wheat production actually ended up being more than the average. So what happened? Well, digging into this, I found out that in the 90s, Goldman Sachs made an index to track commodities,
Yes.
including food.
Yes, there's a wheat index.
Yeah, because they thought it was going to be, it's just an easy way to invest in something that's going to kind of constantly grow with a growing population, right? You need more food, so they're going to make more and more of it. And so people would invest in it, and eventually it got to the point where it was a bubble. And they were just speculating, and they saw the index as a place that they could park their money and watch it grow, because it was called a long only derivative.
Yeah.
People couldn't short it. So it was just going to keep growing and growing. So the thing that happened actually in 2008 and 2011 is people stopped investing. The bubble, a little air was let out of the bubble. And it wasn't actually a problem with global food production. It was just speculators being spooked. And so because of that, since there was less money going into the food market, some countries restricted their exports.
Oh.
And once countries restricted their exports,
Yes.
the most vulnerable importer countries felt the hit.
That's incredible.
Right? And so this is a big part of, a lot of people think this is a big part of what caused the Arab Spring. And that was some of the, worst political unrest in the Middle East ever. So
I want to talk about that relationship with free trade in regards to food.
Yeah.
Because this index tracked that, and it found a very, very significant positive correlation between countries that had good scores and their trade relationships in regards to how freely they were importing and exporting food products. And countries that were limiting or trying to become like autarkish, self-sufficient states had worse food outcomes than those that were open and importing and exporting and taking advantage of comparative advantage that you need to in the modern world.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. Like, globalization has been remarkably economically beneficial.
Definitely.
For everyone.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. And food is so important because it's not only a market within itself, but it's also supporting your population so integrally.
Right.
Right. So, and something that we kind of touched on last week in our deep dive discussion is that people tend to be good for an economy.
Right.
And food means you can have more people.
Yep.
So
we're about to have a lot more people.
Yes, but we also are risking seeing a lot of people dying. So we're just gonna have to see. I think one thing that's kind of good is that there's a tension on this because of Ukraine and Russia. I think that's a difference from what we had in 2008 and 2011 because it was something that was buried deep within the financial system.
Mm-hmm.
People weren't really worried about, like, even though there were some lower harvests, people weren't putting a lot of attention on getting enough food to these underprivileged areas. Now I think there is a little bit more attention on that, but we are still really systemically
At risk. So, like, what's the solution to this?
I have a few. Okay. So technology can help.
That's what I've heard the most.
Yeah.
That was my main thing.
What do you have?
I have like technological usage for pesticide control. I have doing more genetic modification on food to increase its diversity.
Yes. Yeah.
And then increasing the amount of exports and imports that countries are doing and opening up your barriers for that.
Yeah.
That's really all I got, but it's not what I wanted to hear.
No, it's not great. And unfortunately, that last one just probably isn't going to happen.
Right, because we're just going to go into a deglobalized world.
Yeah. Okay, I have antitrust.
Oh, nice.
Which you already mentioned.
Yes.
Just to build our resilience. So one thing is directing government funding towards research in new agricultural techniques. Right now, a lot of government funding kind of aligns with what the private sector is already doing, which is, again, it tends to
not
be
what you want to do.
Towards efficiency, away from diversity. We need the government to do the opposite thing. Okay, like an example is funding more research into soil. And this is something that I didn't really get deep into, but I just read mentions that we know very little about the massively complex system that just the soil that we grow our plants in is. Right now, we're spending way more money on like the Mars rover program to figure out what the surface of that planet is like when we don't actually really understand the surface of our own planet.
It's so fascinating.
And if we are able to learn more about it, then we might be able to engineer healthier and more productive soil to grow more.
And we are running out of healthy soil, which is scary.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need to figure out a way to create healthy soil.
Over farming like this, it does that.
That's what it does.
Yeah.
And the over-reliance on fertilizer, too.
Yes.
Which is another thing. It's really a double-edged sword because you need the fertilizer to get the efficient crops, but overusage of fertilizer destroys your next set of soil, right?
Yeah.
So it's a hard...
And the weird thing is because these farms, they use manure to make their fertilizer, right? And so you've already got a ton of animals there and they're pooping all the time. And you're like, oh, well, I have this easy way to reuse it. But once you're using it too much, it
becomes less effective over time.
Yeah, you're hurting yourself, but you just don't want to figure out another solution for where to put the poop.
Yeah. I was reading that some fertilizer prices were actually coming down a little bit. And the reason was because people were using poop.
Yeah.
Which is not as effective, but they were using poop to avoid paying the high prices.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's not good, though, for the efficiency of the crop, right? It's not good for that. Yeah.
No, definitely not. I mentioned the perennial grain crops. The one other thing I have is precise fermentation, which I didn't look into enough, but they're working on genetically engineering. So genetic engineering thus far for agriculture is focused on plants. They're looking at how to do it with microbes, which apparently can change the nature of certain materials to make them more calorie dense or nutrient dense. It can create, I think I listened to a podcast where someone was talking about how they were able to make a pancake in a lab out of, what is it? I forget what the basic was, but rather than like using your actual eggs or the normal ingredients to a pancake, they have these engineered microbes that can make something that tastes exactly like it, and that apparently can make other foods that might taste like the whole spectrum of what we know.
Wow.
So that might be an option.
That would be my dream come true.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would literally be my dream come true.
So there are possibilities, but they would need to...
Hope is not lost,
fast.
But honestly, the whole point of this show is that we need public investment in research. We need public investment into specific aspects of our economy that are vital for the betterment of human life. That's what we need. And food is the most important out of all of them.
Yeah.
You can't get educated if you can't eat. Okay. This is the most vital thing. And the public research, as I've read in this, has actually declined over the last few years. Public investment into research and development for agricultural stuff has gone down over the last few years. That trend needs to be reversed.
Yeah.
Immediately.
I'm not even that surprised because in addition to this consolidation, the thing about fertilizers is you've got decreasing yields. Like even with advances, like it tends to be a logarithmic scale. Like first of all, about how much fertilizer you put on it, but even with the scientific developments of fertilizer,
like the returns are just getting less and less and less.
Yeah.
I understand. That sucks. I'm just trying so that the audience can understand.
It just levels off. It plateaus.
Like it'll have an exponential benefit, and then it'll stop benefiting so much.
Yes.
Man, that sucks. But there are some solutions, and we can hope they get acted.
Yeah.
And this was a really interesting deep dive.
Yeah.
Because it's not something you think about very often.
Not at all. Well, and that's the thing with us in America. Really, to be honest, you won't have to think about it. We make enough food to sustain ourselves.
Yeah.
So I guess for our audience, it's much more likely to just be a curiosity. But rather than like something to vote on and change potentially.
This was one of my favorite deep dives, I think.
Really?
I think I learned a lot doing this.
I
This
learned a
was cool.
lot. I probably liked studying for it more than talking about it, just because I feel like we weren't very put together.
Yeah, we didn't have like a structured